Long before sharks became the symbol of danger in the sea, long before dolphins, whales, marine reptiles, coral reef fish, or anything that looks familiar to us today, the oceans belonged to a stranger world. This was the Devonian, often called the Age of Fishes, but that name can make it sound too familiar. It was not simply an ocean with older versions of modern fish swimming around. It was a world where vertebrates were still experimenting with what a fish could be. Some had armor over their heads and bodies, some had jaws like blades, some were early sharks, some were lobe-finned fish, moving through shallow waters in ways that would eventually matter for the story of life on land. Reefs grew in warm seas. Invertebrates filled the seafloor, and above them, in ancient water that covered places we now know as North America, one animal carried the image of a living tank. That animal was Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus is one of those prehistoric creatures that almost feels invented for a documentary thumbnail. An armored skull, cutting jaws instead of normal teeth, a reputation as one of the earliest great vertebrate predators, and a body that has been reconstructed for decades as something enormous and monstrous. But if we want to tell the real story, we have to be careful. Dunkleosteus was not a dinosaur fish, it was not a shark, it was not a sea monster in the fantasy sense. It was an arthrodire placoderm, part of an extinct group of armored-jawed fishes that flourished during the Devonian and then disappeared. And that is what makes it more interesting than a monster story. Dunkleosteus belonged to a world before sharks became the icons of ocean predation. Sharks already existed in the Devonian, but they were not yet the dominant image of marine power that they would become later in evolutionary history. The Devonian seas were full of competitors, experiments, armored bodies, strange jaws, and ecological roles that would not last forever. Dunkleosteus was one of the most famous products of that world. Not simply a big fish, but a reminder that before the modern ocean took shape, evolution tried other versions of apex predator. When people imagine Dunkleosteus, they usually imagine the head first. That is partly because the head and front armor are what fossilize best. The animal had a massive armored skull and thoracic shield, giving the front of its body a heavy, plated look. Instead of the teeth we associate with sharks or reptiles, Dunkleosteus had sharp, bony jaw plates that formed cutting blades. When those jaws opened and closed, they could slice rather than chew in the modern sense. The result is an animal that does not look graceful in the way a shark looks graceful. It looks blunt, ancient, mechanical, and brutal. But the fossil record gives us a strange problem. We know the front armor far better than the rest of the body. For a long time, Dunkleosteus was reconstructed as a gigantic elongated predator, sometimes described at lengths far beyond what recent studies support. That older image is still everywhere in pop culture, a huge armored beast, sometimes almost whale-sized, cruising like a nightmare through Paleozoic seas. But newer work has challenged those reconstructions. Because the complete body is not preserved in the same way as the skull and armor, estimates depend on how scientists scale the known head and trunk parts to the rest of the animal. If you scale it like a shark, you get one kind of animal. If you scale it like known arthrodire placoderms, you get something shorter, deeper, and stockier. This matters because Dunkleosteus does not need to be exaggerated to be impressive. In fact, the more cautious modern version may be even stranger. Instead of a sleek giant shark with armor, imagine a shorter, heavier, deep-bodied animal with a huge armored front end, powerful jaws, and a body plan unlike anything alive today. Not necessarily the longest predator in the sea, but one that looked compact, heavily built, and dangerous in a way modern animals do not quite prepare us for. A tank is not terrifying because it is long. It is terrifying because it is armored, concentrated, and hard to ignore. The most careful recent size estimates for Dunkleosteus terrelli suggest typical adults may have been closer to around 3.5 meters long, with the largest known individuals perhaps around 4 meters, though uncertainty remains. That is much smaller than the dramatic numbers often repeated in older sources. But a 4-meter armored predator in a Devonian ocean is still a serious animal. It is about scale in context. You do not measure Dunkleosteus against a blue whale or a modern great white in isolation. You measure it against the ecosystem it lived in, the prey it encountered, the predators it competed with, and the ancient world that built it. In that world, Dunkleosteus was not underwhelming. It was one of the great marine predators of its time. To understand why, we need to step into the Devonian Ocean. The Devonian period began long after the Cambrian explosion had already filled seas with complex animal life. Trilobites were no longer new. Brachiopods, corals, sponges, cephalopods, arthropods, and many other marine animals had been part of ocean ecosystems for a very long time. But vertebrates were going through a revolution. Jawed fishes diversified dramatically. Armored placoderms became common and varied. Early sharks and other cartilaginous fishes were present. Bony fishes were diversifying too, including the lineages that would eventually give rise to most modern fishes, and, through lobe-finned relatives, to tetrapods. This is why the Devonian is called the Age of Fishes. It was not because fish had just appeared. It was because fish became ecologically dominant and morphologically diverse in ways that reshaped aquatic life. Some were small and bottom-dwelling, some were armored, some were fast, some were strange, some were predators, some fed on smaller organisms, some lived in reefs, some in open water, some in shallow coastal habitats, some in freshwater systems. The ocean had become a world of vertebrate experimentation. Dunkleosteus was part of the placoderms, one of the most successful groups of jawed vertebrates of the Devonian. Placoderms are often described as armored fishes, but that phrase hides their diversity. They were not all built like Dunkleosteus. Some were small, some were bottom-oriented, some had different feeding styles, some were heavily armored, some were more streamlined. They occupied many aquatic environments. For a time, placoderms were among the most important vertebrates on Earth. Their armor was not just decoration. It protected them in crowded, dangerous waters. It may also have served physiological roles, such as storing minerals. But in Dunkleosteus, the armor became part of a predatory machine. The head shield and jaws worked together with a complex skull mechanism. Its jaw system has been modeled as capable of opening quickly and closing with high force. Older Bite Force headlines sometimes make this sound almost cartoonishly powerful, comparing it with famous land predators. We should avoid turning that into hype. But the basic point remains. Dunkleosteus had a mechanically impressive bite for a Devonian vertebrate. It did not bite like a shark. Sharks use teeth that are replaced over time. Dunkleosteus had sharpened bony plates. Those plates formed cutting surfaces. When the jaws closed, they could deliver a slicing action against prey. The animal did not need a mouthful of teeth to be dangerous. Its skull was the weapon. That phrase sounds dramatic, but it is anatomically close to the truth. Dunkleosteus was a predator whose most famous weapon was built into the bones of its head. Still, we should not imagine it as an unstoppable armor-crushing monster that ate everything in sight. Paleontology is more careful than that. Scientists debate what Dunkleosteus fed on, and exactly how it captured prey. Some reconstructions emphasize high bite forces and rapid jaw opening, possibly creating suction that helped draw prey inward. Others urge caution in how we interpret those models. The fossils show jaw architecture and wear, but they do not give us a video of the animal hunting. We can infer, compare and model, but we should not pretend every detail is settled. That caution is important, because Dunkleosteus is often trapped between two exaggerations. One exaggeration turns it into a gigantic sea monster. The other, reacting against that hype, shrinks it into something unimpressive. The better view is between those extremes. Dunkleosteus was likely smaller than old pop culture reconstructions suggested, but it was still a powerful, heavily armored Devonian predator with a unique feeding apparatus and a prominent ecological role. It was not less fascinating because it was shorter. It was more scientifically interesting because it was different. Its world was different too. Imagine the seafloor beneath Devonian waters. There are reefs built by ancient organisms, not modern coral reef communities as we know them, but complex marine habitats with brachiopods, corals, sponges, crinoids, trilobites in decline compared with earlier eras and other invertebrates. Early ammonoids begin to appear. Jawed fishes patrol the water. Placoderms occupy many roles. Early sharks move through the system, not yet the rulers of the public imagination, but already part of the story. The water is warm in many shallow marine settings. Continents sit in unfamiliar positions. Forests are beginning to transform land, but the sea remains one of the main theaters of animal innovation. The Devonian Ocean was not empty space with one armored giant. It was crowded, layered, and competitive. That is important because predators are shaped by ecosystems. A predator only makes sense if there is prey, competition, habitat, and energy flow. Dunkleosteus was not a monster dropped into an aquarium. It was an animal that evolved inside an ecosystem full of other animals trying to survive. One reason Dunkleosteus feels so alien is that modern oceans have trained us to expect certain shapes. We expect fast predators to look like sharks, tuna, dolphins, or marine reptiles in museum murals. Smooth bodies, fins, tails, speed. Dunkleosteus breaks that expectation. Its preserved front end looks like armor from a medieval helmet. Its mouth looks like a bone shear. Its body, in newer reconstructions, may have been deep and compact rather than long and shark-like. It was a predator from a time when vertebrate evolution had not yet settled into the familiar marine silhouettes we know today. That is why built like a tank works as an image, as long as we do not take it too literally. A tank is armored and forward-heavy. Dunkleosteus gives that impression. Unlike a tank, it had to move through water, control buoyancy, turn, feed, breathe, and live as an animal. Its armor was part of a functional body, not a costume. Too much armor can be a burden. Heavy protection may reduce flexibility. A predator must balance strength with movement. Dunkleosteus was not just armor. It had to make armor work in a living ocean. That balance is one of the deeper stories here. Evolution does not produce perfect monsters. It produces compromises. A huge head and jaw mechanism help with feeding, but they create demands for muscle, support, and movement. Armor protects, but it adds mass. A deep body may be powerful, but not necessarily built for endless high-speed pursuit. Dunkleosteus may have been a predator that relied on sudden strikes, powerful biting, and ecological opportunity, rather than long-distance chase in the style of modern open-ocean speedsters. We should picture it less like a torpedo, and more like a heavy ambush capable or cruising predator of Devonian waters, though the exact lifestyle is still debated. It likely fed on other fishes, and perhaps other marine animals, using its jaw plates to cut and process prey. It may have targeted armored or softer animals depending on species, size, and opportunity. The key point is not that it could bite through anything. The key point is that it was part of a new level of vertebrate predation. Predation changes worlds. Once animals can actively hunt with jaws, speed, vision, and cutting structures, prey must respond. Armor becomes meaningful. Escape becomes meaningful. Body depth, maneuverability, sensory systems, and schooling or hiding behaviors become part of an evolutionary conversation. The Devonian was not the beginning of predation, but it was a time when jawed vertebrate predation became increasingly important. Dunkleosteus sits in that story as one of the most visually dramatic examples. Its jaws also remind us how strange early jaw evolution was. Modern jaws feel natural because we live among jawed vertebrates, fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, humans. But jaws were one of the great innovations in vertebrate history. They transformed feeding. A jaw allows an animal to seize, cut, crush, manipulate, and process food in ways that jawless vertebrates cannot. Placoderms were among the early experiments in this new jawed world. Dunkleosteus shows that very early in the history of jawed vertebrates, evolution had already produced large predators with impressive mechanical systems. This makes Dunkleosteus important beyond its fame. It is not just a weird fish. It is evidence that vertebrate predatory systems became powerful long before the marine predators most people know. Before mosasaurs, before ichthyosaurs, before plesiosaurs, before megalodon, before even the great shark lineages of later oceans, a placoderm with armored plates and cutting jaws was already occupying the top of a food web. That is why the phrase, "before sharks ruled," matters. Sharks are ancient, and they were present during the Devonian, but the Devonian predator world did not belong to sharks alone. Placoderms were major players. In fact, for a time, armored fishes were among the dominant vertebrates in the water. Then they vanished. Sharks survived. Bony fishes survived and diversified enormously. Placoderms, despite their success, disappeared by the end of the Devonian. That disappearance is one of the great turns in the story. Why did armored fishes disappear? There is no single simple answer. The late Devonian was a time of environmental crises and extinctions. Marine ecosystems were disrupted. Reef systems suffered. Oxygen levels, climate, sea level, and ecological structures changed across a series of events, rather than one clean disaster. Placoderms, including groups like Arthrodires, did not survive into the later Paleozoic. sharks and bony fishes did. It is tempting to say placoderms were outcompeted by sharks and bony fishes. Competition may have mattered in some contexts, but the extinction story is more complicated. Groups vanish not only because another group is better, but because environments change, food webs collapse, reproductive strategies fail under new pressures, habitats disappear, or entire ecosystems reorganize. Placoderms had been successful for tens of millions of years. Their extinction was not proof that they were poorly designed. It was proof that success in evolution is always temporary. Dunkleosteus did not lose because it was a bad predator. It belonged to a world that ended. That may be the most powerful way to understand it. Dunkleosteus was not a primitive failure waiting to be replaced by superior sharks. It was a successful animal in a successful group during a specific evolutionary moment. When that moment passed, the group vanished. Sharks, with different bodies and evolutionary histories, continued. Bony fishes expanded. Later oceans developed new predator roles. The age of armored placoderm giants closed. This is one of the reasons prehistoric life is so humbling. The animals we know today are not the inevitable winners from the beginning. They are survivors of a long, unstable history. The ocean could have been ruled by very different kinds of vertebrates for longer than it was. For a while it was. The Devonian reminds us that modern marine life is only the latest version of the sea, not the original, and not the only possible one. Dunkleosteus also reminds us that fossils can deceive the imagination if we are not careful. Because the skull armor is so dramatic, it is easy to build the entire animal around drama. Because old size estimates were huge, it is easy to repeat them. Because bite force headlines are memorable, it is easy to turn a biomechanical model into a monster statistic. But science becomes more interesting when we accept uncertainty. The real animal is not less compelling because we cannot say everything with absolute confidence. It becomes more compelling because we can watch knowledge change. The recent resizing of Dunkleosteus is a perfect example. For years, popular reconstructions often presented it as a very long animal, sometimes 6, 8, or even more meters depending on the source. Then newer analysis argued that those estimates were likely inflated because they scaled from modern sharks or other unsuitable comparisons. If Arthrodire body proportions were shorter and deeper, then Dunkleosteus was likely more compact. That change may feel disappointing if you grew up with the enormous version, but scientifically, it is exciting. It brings the animal closer to what the fossils actually support, and a compact Dunkleosteus may be more believable as an animal. A shorter, deeper, massive-bodied predator with a large armored head fits better with what we know of related arthrodires. It also creates a more distinctive silhouette. Instead of imagining a shark with a bony helmet, we imagine something with no close modern equivalent, a deep-bodied armored fish with a skull engineered for cutting. That is more alien, not less. The Cleveland Shale and other late Devonian deposits are central to the Dunkleosteus story. Fossils from what is now Ohio preserve evidence of a warm ancient sea, not a modern Lake Erie shoreline. It is strange to stand in a modern inland landscape and imagine that it once lay beneath tropical water filled with armored fish, early sharks, invertebrates, and other Devonian life. But that is what deep time does. It turns familiar places into alien worlds. The ground under ordinary cities can hold the remains of oceans older than forests and reptiles. Dunkleosteus terrelli is especially tied to the Cleveland area in public imagination because of famous fossils and museum displays. The animal has become a kind of local prehistoric icon, but its fossils are not only a local curiosity, they belong to a global evolutionary story about jawed vertebrates, Devonian ecosystems, and extinction. A fossil skull in a museum is not just a scary head. It is a preserved piece of a vanished ocean. One of the most striking things about Dunkleosteus is that its fearsome image comes from absence as much as presence. We have the armor and jaws, but the soft body is mostly missing. We reconstruct the rest by comparing anatomy, related animals, preserved trunk armor, and biomechanical constraints. That means every life reconstruction carries uncertainty. Tail shape, body depth, swimming style, and exact proportions are not equally certain. A responsible documentary should show that uncertainty rather than hide it. This is not a weakness, it is part of the drama. Paleontology is detective work with incomplete evidence. You do not get the whole body gift wrapped. You get fragments, a skull plate, a jaw, Armor, a fin impression if you are lucky, sediment context, bite marks, associated fauna. From that, scientists build models and test them against anatomy. When better methods appear, the image changes. Dunkleosteus has been changing before our eyes because the science is alive. That is also why the animal is such a good subject for a science story. It has the visual hook of a monster, but the real substance of a scientific debate. How big was it? How did it feed? How fast could it open its jaws? What did it eat? Was it built for speed, ambush, cruising, or something else? How did it fit into Devonian ecosystems? Why did its group vanish? Each question takes us deeper than the skull. Let's stay with the feeding mechanics for a moment. Dunkleosteus had a head and jaw structure that could move in a distinctive way. The upper skull and lower jaw were not simply a modern fish mouth opening and closing in a familiar pattern. Biomechanical studies have suggested a linkage system that allowed rapid mouth opening and powerful closure. Rapid opening could create suction, helping pull prey toward the mouth. Powerful closure could bring the bony blades together with cutting force. This combination would be valuable for a predator in a three-dimensional aquatic environment. But again, models are models. They are based on anatomy, assumptions about muscles, and comparisons. They are not footage. The safest phrasing is that Dunkleosteus appears to have had a mechanically powerful jaw system, capable of rapid opening and strong biting. Not that we know every hunting behavior with certainty. This keeps the animal impressive without turning science into exaggeration. What might prey have looked like? Other placoderms, smaller fishes, early sharks, soft-bodied animals, cephalopods, and various marine organisms lived in Devonian ecosystems. Dunkleosteus may have been capable of attacking a variety of prey depending on size and availability. Some fossil evidence, including damaged armor and preserved remains in related contexts, suggests Devonian seas included intense predator-prey interactions. This was a fish-eat-fish world in a literal sense, but also a world where different feeding strategies were being tested. If you were a smaller Devonian fish, Dunkleosteus would not need to be a 10-meter giant to be terrifying. A 3 to 4 meter armored predator with a large cutting mouth is more than enough. For scale, many animals in that ecosystem were much smaller. Size is relative. A wolf is not huge compared with an elephant, but it is huge to a rabbit. Dunkleosteus was not competing for internet monster rankings. It was hunting in a Devonian ocean. This is one of the biggest lessons in prehistoric storytelling. Context matters more than scoreboard thinking. People often ask whether Dunkleosteus could beat a shark, whether it was bigger than a crocodile, whether its bite was stronger than something else. Those comparisons can be fun, but they often flatten the science. Dunkleosteus did not live with modern great whites, crocodiles, or mosasaurs. Its success was measured by Devonian rules. The question is not whether it wins a fantasy battle. The question is how it worked in its own world. In its own world, it was remarkable. The Devonian Sea was also connected to changes on land. Plants were spreading and diversifying. Early forests began to develop during the Devonian. Roots and soils changed landscapes. Rivers carried sediments and nutrients into seas. The evolution of life on land did not happen in isolation from the ocean. Earth systems are connected. Changes in vegetation can affect weathering, carbon cycles, nutrient runoff, and marine chemistry. The Devonian was a period of transformation across the whole planet, not only underwater. That planetary context matters when we think about the late Devonian extinctions. As ecosystems became more complex, they also became vulnerable to disruption. Reef communities suffered. Marine oxygen conditions may have changed in many settings. Different extinction pulses affected different groups. Placoderms disappeared by the end of the Devonian. The armored predator world collapsed. Out of that collapse, later marine ecosystems would be reorganized. In a way, Dunkleosteus stands near the end of a great experiment. Placoderms had achieved diversity and dominance. Some were small, some large, some armored bottom dwellers, some open water predators. Dunkleosteus was one of the most famous apex forms. Then the experiment ended. Not because placoderms had failed from the start, but because evolutionary success is always tied to environmental stability, ecological fit, and historical luck. This is where the documentary story becomes more than a predator profile. Dunkleosteus is exciting because it was dangerous, but it is meaningful because it belonged to a lost architecture of life. It represents a world where armored-jawed fishes were central players. That world is gone. No living animal is a placoderm. Sharks survived. Ray-finned fishes became enormously diverse. Tetrapods eventually moved onto land and, much later, gave rise to reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, birds, and humans. But the armored fish empire vanished. When you look into the face of Dunkleosteus, you are looking at a branch of vertebrate history that did not continue. That can make the animal feel eerie. It is familiar enough to be called a fish, but unfamiliar enough that the word fish almost feels inadequate. It had jaws, fins, a vertebrate body, and predatory behavior. Yet its armor and skeletal design place it in a vanished experiment. It is both part of our broader vertebrate story and profoundly other. That otherness is what gives the Devonian Ocean its power. This was not just the world before dinosaurs. It was a world before many of the assumptions we make about marine life. Predatory fish did not have to look like sharks. Armored bodies could be dominant. Jaw plates could replace teeth. Reefs could be built by ancient communities unlike modern ones. Early forests were only beginning to alter land. The planet was alive, but not yet familiar. If the Cambrian is the moment animal life becomes weird, the Devonian is the moment vertebrate life becomes bold. Fish diversify into forms that seem experimental and confident. Some develop armor, some refine jaws, some move toward the body plans that will eventually matter for land vertebrates. Some become predators with skulls like machines. The sea becomes a theater for vertebrate power. Dunkleosteus was one of the stars of that theater. But it was not alone. Early sharks were there too, and their survival makes their story look inevitable in hindsight. But it was not inevitable. Sharks were one lineage among several. Bony fishes were diversifying. Placoderms were dominant in many settings. The Devonian was not a clean handoff from primitive fish to modern fish. It was a crowded evolutionary contest with many viable strategies. Armor worked, cartilage worked, bone worked, jaws worked, fins worked in many forms. The future had not yet narrowed. That is why the disappearance of placoderms is so important. We tend to think of extinct groups as stepping stones toward living groups, but placoderms were not just stepping stones. They were successful animals with their own history. Dunkleosteus was not waiting to be replaced by a shark. It was living fully in its own evolutionary moment. Extinction turned it into a fossil icon, but while alive, it was part of an active world. There is something almost tragic in that. A predator can dominate its world and still vanish with it. Strength does not guarantee survival across mass extinction. Armor does not guarantee permanence. A powerful bite does not protect a lineage from global environmental disruption. The traits that make an animal successful in one world may not save it when the world changes. That is one of the deep messages of paleontology. Every organism is an answer to a question asked by its environment. When the question changes, yesterday's best answer may no longer work. Dunkleosteus was an answer to the Devonian Ocean. A powerful one, a memorable one. But the Devonian question did not last forever. So what was Dunkleosteus really? It was a large arthrodire placoderm from the late Devonian. It was an armored-jawed vertebrate with blade-like jaw plates. It was likely one of the major predators in the ecosystems where it lived. Its size has been debated, with recent estimates making it shorter and stockier than older reconstructions. It belonged to a diverse group of armored fishes that flourished during the Age of Fishes and vanished at the end of the Devonian. It lived in a world before dinosaurs, before marine reptiles, before modern shark-dominated imagery, when vertebrate predation was still being shaped. But that definition still does not capture the feeling of it. Dunkleosteus was a reminder that the ocean has had many rulers. Some had teeth, some had shells, some had armor, some had jaws made of bone blades. The sea has never belonged to one design forever. If you want to imagine it honestly, do not picture a fantasy monster roaring through the water. Picture a dark Devonian sea. Light filters down through warm, shallow water over an ancient basin. The seafloor is alive with invertebrates. Smaller fishes move through the water. Early sharks are present, but they are not yet the ultimate symbol of marine terror. From the gloom comes a heavy shape, not long and elegant, but deep, armored, and strange. Its head is plated. Its jaws are not lined with teeth, but sharpened bone. It is not a shark before sharks. It is something else entirely. A predator from a version of Earth that no longer exists. That is why Dunkleosteus deserves more than monster treatment. It is not interesting only because it could bite. It is interesting because it shows us a vanished solution to the predator problem. It shows how evolution once built a top marine hunter from armor, plates, linkages, and bone blades. It shows that the story of ocean predators did not begin with sharks and does not end with them. It shows that ancient seas were stranger, richer, and more experimental than our familiar blue planet suggests. And perhaps most importantly, Dunkleosteus shows how science changes the monsters we think we know. The old giant image is giving way to a more compact animal. Bite force numbers are impressive but must be handled carefully. Body shape is debated. Feeding style is reconstructed, not filmed. The more we learn, the less Dunkleosteus becomes a cartoon, and the more it becomes a real animal. A real animal is always better than a monster, because a monster only has to be scary. A real animal has to breathe, feed, move, grow, compete, reproduce, and survive in a specific world. Dunkleosteus did all of that in the Devonian Sea. Its armor was not decoration. Its jaws were not special effects. Its body was not built for our imagination. It was built by evolution under ancient conditions, and it worked until the world that supported it changed. That is the story worth telling. Before sharks ruled the imagination of the sea, an armored fish cut through Devonian waters with a skull like a weapon. It was not the biggest predator ever. It was not a timeless king of the ocean. It was something more precise and more haunting, a top predator from a lost age, powerful in its own world, strange in ours, and preserved in stone just long enough for us to meet it. There is another reason Dunkleosteus stays with us. It forces us to separate scale from significance. Popular prehistoric media often treats size as the only measure of importance. Bigger means more impressive, longer means more dangerous, but that is not how ecology works. A predator does not need to be the largest animal that ever lived to dominate its own habitat. It needs to be effective within its food web. It needs to be large enough, strong enough, well adapted enough, and placed in the right ecological context. In the late Devonian seas where Dunkleosteus lived, a compact, armored, powerful arthrodire could be far more important than a longer animal that belongs to a different time and ecosystem. This is why the size debate should not be treated like a downgrade. A shorter Dunkleosteus does not make the Devonian Ocean less strange. It makes the animal more plausible, more specific, and more different from a modern shark. If the newer estimates are closer to the truth, then Dunkleosteus was not a stretched-out sea dragon. It was a dense, deep-bodied predator with a huge armored head, a body plan that modern viewers are not used to, and a feeding system unlike the toothy jaws that dominate our idea of ocean predators. That version is not less cinematic. It is more alien. The same is true of its bite. It is easy to repeat the biggest number ever attached to Dunkleosteus and leave it there, but a documentary should do better. The important story is not only how many pounds of force might be estimated under a particular model. The important story is that early jawed vertebrates had already evolved powerful feeding mechanics. Dunkleosteus shows us that very early in vertebrate history, jaws were not simple tools. They were complex systems. They could open rapidly, close strongly, and interact with skull armor in ways that allowed new predatory roles. That is the evolutionary story behind the terrifying image. A jaw is a revolution because it turns the head into an active feeding machine. For a predator, that means more than simply taking a bite. It means approaching prey differently. It means controlling water flow around the mouth. It means cutting, gripping, shearing, or crushing depending on anatomy. It means the skull can become part of an ecological strategy. In Dunkleosteus, the skull was not just a container for the brain and senses. It was armor, hinge, blade, and feeding apparatus at once. The animal also reminds us that armor is not a primitive costume that evolution later abandoned because it was foolish. Armor can be highly successful under the right conditions. Turtles still use armor. Armadillos use armor. Many fishes have plates, scales, spines, or bony defenses. The placoderm style of heavy head and thoracic armor disappeared, but the principle of protection never vanished from evolution. What vanished was a particular experiment in how vertebrates could build and use armor. That makes Dunkleosteus feel like a lost answer. Evolution asked, what if a major marine predator were built around an armored front end and bladed bony jaws? For a time the answer worked. Then the world changed, and the answer was removed from the living ocean. Fossils are the only reason we know that answer ever existed. This is also why reconstruction should show the Devonian ecosystem, not only the animal. If you isolate Dunkleosteus against a black background, it becomes a monster portrait. If you place it among placoderms, early sharks, smaller fishes, invertebrates, reefs, dark shale-forming basins, and the broader age of fishes, it becomes part of a world. That world is the real attraction. It was a sea where vertebrates were becoming major players, where jaws and armor changed the rules, and where future winners had not yet been chosen. The Devonian was also a period when life on land was changing in ways that would eventually reshape the planet. Plants were becoming more complex. Roots and early forests altered soils and landscapes. Early arthropods were moving through terrestrial habitats. The first tetrapods would appear from fish-like ancestors. The whole Earth was in transition. Dunkleosteus was not part of the land story directly, but it lived during the same grand interval of vertebrate and ecosystem innovation. While some fish lineages were moving toward land, others were becoming armored rulers of the sea. That contrast is powerful. In one branch of the vertebrate story, fins were beginning a path that would eventually lead to limbs. In another, placoderms were pushing armor and jaws toward predatory dominance. One path continued into the modern world. The other ended. Both were real. Both were successful in their time. Evolution is full of these branching possibilities, and Dunkleosteus stands on one of the great lost branches. When we say it ruled before sharks, we should not imagine a crown passing neatly from one animal to another. Nature does not work like a royal succession. There was overlap, competition, environmental disruption, extinction, survival, and diversification. Sharks did not simply defeat Dunkleosteus in a duel. The Devonian world broke apart through ecological and environmental change, and different lineages passed through that filter in different ways. Sharks made it through. Placoderms did not. That is more interesting than a battle. It shows that survival is not always about being the fiercest individual predator. It is about lineage-level resilience across changing conditions. A group can produce terrifying animals and still fail to survive a crisis. Another group can be less dominant at one moment and later become iconic. The history of life is full of delayed victories and sudden endings. Dunkleosteus therefore belongs to two stories at once. In one story, it is a predator, armored, powerful, strange, and visually unforgettable. In the other, it is a symbol of extinction, a reminder that even dominant designs can vanish completely. That double identity gives the animal its real documentary strength. It lets us move from fear to wonder, and from wonder to humility. If you only call it a monster, you miss the humility, because the truth is that every living lineage exists on borrowed time. Sharks survived the Devonian and many later crises, but even they are not guaranteed forever. Mammals rose after dinosaur extinction, but that does not make mammals permanent. Humans are recent, fragile, and deeply dependent on conditions we did not create. Dunkleosteus looks ancient and distant, but its extinction speaks to a universal rule: no form owns the future. So the next time you see its armored skull in a museum, do not just think about its bite. Think about the missing body. Think about the warm Devonian sea. Think about the other animals around it. Think about the early sharks that shared the water, the armored fishes that no longer exist, the reefs and sediments that preserved the fossils, and the environmental changes that ended its world. Think about how much of natural history is not a line of progress, but a graveyard of successful experiments. That is what makes Dunkleosteus more than a prehistoric fish. It is a doorway into an ocean before our ocean, a predator before our predator myths, and a body plan before the living world settled into the shapes we now call normal. There is also a human side to the way we imagine Dunkleosteus. We keep returning to animals like this because they make deep time feel physical. A date like 360 million years ago is almost impossible to feel. It is too large, too abstract. But an armored skull with cutting jaws is not abstract. You can stand in front of it, you can see the plates, you can imagine the mouth opening. Suddenly the Devonian is not just a line on a geological chart. It is a body, a face, a predator, a vanished presence that once moved through water. That is the power of fossil animals. They give deep time a shape. Without them, geological periods can feel like empty labels: Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous. With them, those words become worlds. The Devonian becomes not only the age of fishes, but the age of armored heads, bladed jaws, early sharks, reef communities, lobe-finned fishes, and ecosystems that were both ancient and alive. Dunkleosteus is one of the clearest symbols of that world, because its skull seems to carry the personality of the entire period. Heavy, experimental, dangerous, and unlike the present. But symbols can distort. If we make Dunkleosteus too monstrous, we lose the animal. If we make it too small in our imagination, we lose its ecological force. The goal is to hold both truths together. It was not the exaggerated giant of every old poster, but it was still a formidable apex predator of its time. It was not a shark, but it helps explain why the history of ocean predation is older and stranger than sharks. It was not a failure, but a member of a successful extinct group whose story ended with environmental crisis. That balanced view is more satisfying than hype, because it lets the animal remain real. A real Dunkleosteus had limits. It had a metabolism, a growth pattern, injuries, competition, and habitat constraints. It may have succeeded sometimes and failed other times. It may have scavenged as well as hunted, when opportunity allowed. It may have avoided some risks and taken others. Like any predator, it was not a machine of constant killing. It was a living vertebrate trying to get enough energy to survive in a difficult ocean. And that makes it easier, not harder, to respect. In the end, the strongest image is not a cartoon monster snapping at the camera. It is a real fossil animal restored carefully enough to keep its uncertainty. Armor in front, unknown softness behind it, a head built for feeding, a body shaped by a vanished sea, and a lineage that once mattered enormously before disappearing completely. That image is stranger, sadder, and more powerful than exaggeration. That is the version worth carrying forward, not bigger than evidence allows, but still enormous in evolutionary meaning today. Dunkleosteus ruled before the modern ocean was born. And then, like the armored world that made it, it disappeared.